If the member refuses to listen, tell it to the church. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Tell it to the church. If Jesus used those exact words, there'd have been some smart aleck in the back row who'd straightway have put up his hand and asked, Lord, what is a church? And he'd have had a point. We're only halfway through St. Matthew's Gospel. We've heard of disciples and a few other friends, and there's often been mention of a crowd, but the church, well, that surely comes later. I'm sure Jesus said something very much like this, possibly about the people who followed him, but there was no such thing as a church. So it may be that Matthew, when he writes this, is talking from experience of his own community, perhaps some 40 years later. Doubtless Christ said something like it, as I say, but he would not have used, I suggest, the word church. But even so, it's telling that in Jesus' own day there was a need for reconciliation, need for a mechanism for forgiveness. And the need for it, of course, is greater today than it's ever been. Jesus makes it sound very simple. Just take it to the church and it will be sorted. A direct instruction from the Lord. You might expect it to have become a cornerstone of Christian practice. Perhaps we should give it a try, because the world is in need of reconciliation and forgiveness as much as it's ever been. It's something Christians are supposed to know about. They're supposed to be the experts. We're told the government is preparing for a time of civil unrest. What can the church contribute to the healing of the world? Well, there's no doubt that we know the questions that need to be asked. We know the questions that need to be asked, and we have answers too. But a solution? Well, perhaps we do have that too, but let's go back a step. I went to a talk by someone who worked with the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If lessons are to be learned anywhere, that's as good a place as any to start, though I'm not going to talk about South Africa because I myself don't know enough about it. But he said the aim was to try to bring peace, to try and find a way for people to live together in harmony after 50 years of apartheid. A noble aim, and one to which surely everyone in a place of strife and mutual suspicion, everyone would want to sign up. But how do you do it? How do you arrange it? What's the process? Do you just persuade people to draw a line under everything? Walk away from it, visualize a land of peace and prosperity, and then plan a way to make it happen? Well, you could try, but people have long memories. They know things that have happened, stories that could be told. And are you just going to suppress these in the aim of keeping everybody happy? Memories that fester. You can't just put a lid on it. People need a chance to put their own side of things, to have their stories told. There will be anger and bitterness. We can't bear too much truth. And as it all pours out, what hope is there that your first good intentions, the fragile beginnings of peace, will survive the torrent of bad memories, inexcusable wrongs? As it all emerges, two things will become apparent. First, that it will be a lifetime's work to listen to the stories of all parties and establish some kind of truth from them at what actually did happen. And secondly, you'll discover that the way forward can only involve a massive change of heart, a huge willingness to offer and also receive forgiveness. And straightway that will mobilize a fourth factor. If the time of disharmony that you've all been through, if that time has left you in a very much better position than me, I'm going to want things to be leveled up a bit before I'm going to feel any chance of feeling a bit peaceful. If you've got a fleet of cars and I'm struggling to afford a pair of shoes, if your family's lived in a castle since the Norman conquest, while my grandfather, himself grandson of a slave, came over with the Windrush, well, we'll have a bit of catching up to do. The task will be gigantic, Herculean. It will take decades of debate, consultation, legislation, arbitration, meditation, give and take. Sorry, I said meditation, I meant mediation. Mediation, give and take, setbacks, recovery from setbacks. It will be endless. It's a familiar process. We saw it in Northern Ireland, we've seen it elsewhere, we've been doing it for centuries. We've learned that we have to be patient. We do have to be patient. After all, Edward II conquered Wales in 1283. 1283 he conquered Wales, and how do you fancy your chances today of imposing a uniform regime of travel restrictions during a pandemic without somebody complaining? As I've said, reconciliation and forgiveness. We know the questions to be asked, and we know what kind of answers you might give. But a solution? The people of Israel were in an impossible position. For 700 years, their nation, which had been assured of independence and prosperity for 700 years, they'd been under the thumb of a succession of foreign powers. History, they say, is written by the winners, but the Old Testament is an exception to that. It documents 700 years of loss and failure. And when Jesus was born, the nation was at its weakest, a far-flung province in the strongest and most durable empire the Western world would ever know. The situation was hopeless. What was Jesus to do? Well, the solution he provided was astonishing, unprecedented, so paradoxical that although it is the sole foundation of what came to be known as Christendom, the sole foundation of what came to be known as Christendom, no one ever talks about it or recognizes it. What he did has a name, though no one ever pronounces it or talks about it. What it's called, what Christ did, was recapitulation. Recapitulation. Hands up if you can explain what this process was. Recapitulation. Well, it's exactly what it says. Christ started off by recapitulating the whole history of Israel. By recapitulating the whole history of Israel, that whole history that had gone so badly wrong, he repeated it in his own way. Take his resurrection, which happened, of course, in a tomb, in a garden where he was mistaken for the gardener, the new Adam, in the Garden of Eden, the new Adam at the beginning of the new creation, right back to the first verse of Genesis. Born in Bethlehem, like King David. He straightway was taken down to Egypt to avoid the massacre of the innocents, and he came back again, just as the people of Israel had gone into Egypt and eventually come back. At the beginning of his ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness to remind you of Moses and the people of old who spent 40 years there. At his baptism, the Holy Spirit hovered over the water, over the River Jordan, as it had done over the water of creation in Genesis. His crucifixion was the sacrifice of Isaac, the beloved son, over again, though this time with a different ending. He fed the people in the wilderness with bread, like Moses with manna. He performed miracles of healing like Elijah and Elisha, but he did it better. He gave a Sermon on the Mount and delivered the Beatitudes, like Moses going up onto a mountain for the tablets and bringing back the commandments. I could go on. It's a long list. You can look it up for yourselves. He recapitulated the whole history of Israel. And then he said, take me as your history. Take me as your history. This past of yours, these centuries of strife and disappointment that have done you so little good, step aside from that history and root yourself in me. The past cannot hurt you anymore. Step out of it as you might put off old clothing, as St. Paul calls it, put off the old Adam, and put on new clothes. New clothes, a new armour, indeed, he says, because it will still be a struggle, but one where the victory is assured. Take me as your past, he said, and also, of course, as your present. And you know, all those hopes for the future that the nation had, all those hopes, all those aspirations, all those plans, promises and prophecies that somehow came to nothing, well, take me for your future as well. Together we'll make an entirely fresh start. And we'll begin with peace. We'll begin with peace, because my peace I give you, not as the world gives, do I give peace unto you. Our new life will be based on truth, because I am the truth and the life, he says. We will be reconciled because we will be one, as I and the Father are one. Take me as your past. Take me as your present. Take me as your future. That was his proposal. What a wildly impractical plan. It couldn't work. It couldn't even begin to take off. And yet it did. Here we are still. St. Paul said, we're neither Jew nor Greek. Gentiles and Jews came in together, stepped aside from the past they'd known, formed a new community, a new creation. Christianity spread around the known world and beyond. And the church was, as Jesus had promised, it was a body that transcended the individual history of each single member, gave them a new identity and the same shared hope of a glorious and eternal future. It worked. So, to go back to what I talked about at the beginning, the need for reconciliation in the year 2020. When it comes to reconciliation, Christianity started with a universal solution which actually provided what was needed. And that is our inheritance. We are the guardians of this body, this organisation, this church, that has access to the leaves of the trees that are for the healing of the nations. It may not look that way as we worry about bats and self-isolation and paying the parish share. And yet, despite all that, we are the possessors of things that the angels long to look into. You must be getting tired of me saying I'm going to continue next week. I'm sorry, but there isn't a quick end to this. Not yet. Anyway, it's the biggest of all the questions. How can we repurpose the church? How can we repurpose the church worldwide, in Oxford Diocese, in Sulhamstead, and up to Nervid, so that the church can fulfil this function that the world so badly needs? I promise we will get there, but not quite yet. Not this week. Not today.